On June 22, 1969, Judy Garland was found dead in London at just 47 years old, and the shock of that news cut deeper than the death of an ordinary star. This was not simply the end of a famous actress, or even the end of a beloved singer. To millions of people, Judy Garland had long since become something far more fragile and far more permanent at the same time. A voice of hope, a face of heartbreak, and a piece of emotional memory that seemed too deeply woven into American culture to ever vanish in such an ordinary, brutal way. By the time the coroner ruled that she had died from an accidental barbiturate overdose, the contradiction at the center of her life had already become unbearable. The woman who gave the world Over the Rainbow, the girl whose voice had once promised that somewhere beyond grief there was still light, had died in a quiet room far from the fantasy she helped create. That is where this story has to begin. Not with MGM, not with Dorothy, not with the legend, but with the terrible silence that followed the realization that Judy Garland, one of the most recognizable and emotionally beloved women of the 20th century, had reached an ending so lonely, so exhausted, and so painfully human that it shattered the myth all at once. Because that is what made her death feel different. The public did not lose only a celebrity. It lost the illusion that someone who had spent a lifetime singing hope into other people's darkness could somehow remain protected from her own. And what made Judy Garland's death so haunting was that the world already understood her through the image of survival long before it understood the cost of that survival. She had been the child star who became Dorothy, the girl with the trembling voice and the giant eyes, the performer who could make sorrow sound beautiful enough to survive. She had also been a woman chased for decades by the demands of studios, audiences, expectations, performances, and the exhausting pressure of staying luminous while her private life kept breaking underneath her. By 1969, she was not simply an aging Hollywood legend. She was a living contradiction, adored and unstable, iconic and exhausted, loved by the public and yet still somehow alone inside the machinery of fame that had consumed her since childhood. That is why the hook of her story has to be this cruel. Judy Garland spent her life giving the world one of cinema's greatest symbols of innocence and longing, yet she died carrying the wreckage of a life that had been worked over by fame, dependence, and emotional wear for far too long. The girl who once stood at the edge of a technicolor world and sang about somewhere better did not get a fairy tale ending. She got an accidental overdose in London, a stunned public, and a question that still hurts because it feels too large for one woman to have had to bear alone. How did Hollywood's most beloved girl become one of its most devastating tragedies? That question is the wound at the center of everything that follows. Long before the world knew her as Judy Garland, she was Frances Ethel Gumm, a little girl born into a family that was already living inside performance. Her parents were vaudevillians who operated a theater in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, and the stage entered her life so early that it almost arrived before memory itself. Britannica notes that she made her stage debut at the age of 2.5, and by the time most children were only beginning to understand the shape of ordinary childhood, Judy was already being taught how to sing for applause, how to stand under lights, and how to turn attention into survival. That matters because the emotional truth of her early life is not simply that she was talented. It is that she was formed in public. Childhood for Judy Garland was never fully private. It was wrapped inside rehearsals, family performance, and the constant expectation that the little girl with the extraordinary voice would keep going. She first appeared with her sisters as part of the Gumm Sisters, and even the name itself sounds less like a family and more like the beginning of a product. Britannica also records that Variety had already noticed her by the age of 10, calling her a singing sensation, which tells you how quickly the machine around her began to recognize what she could be worth. Her family moved to California, and as Hollywood drew closer, the line between gifted child and working performer became thinner and thinner. That is the real sadness buried inside the miracle of Judy Garland's beginnings. She did not merely discover the stage young. She was raised by it, shaped by it, and quietly claimed by it before she was old enough to understand what it would one day demand in return. By the time Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer signed her in 1935, Judy Garland was only 13, and already the next transformation had begun. The studio did not quite know what to do with her at first. She was too old for the most obvious child star mold, too young for adult glamour, and physically unlike the polished, manufactured femininity MGM preferred for its future leading ladies. Wikipedia's summary of her early MGM years captures that awkwardness well. She entered the studio as a teenager caught between categories, and MGM immediately began trying to shape her into something usable. Yet this uncertain beginning is what makes part 2 so important. Judy Garland did not enter Hollywood as a finished legend stepping naturally into destiny. She entered as a vulnerable adolescent with a huge voice, unusual emotional depth, and a body the studio system already wanted to discipline and control. She was placed in supporting musical roles, frequently paired with Mickey Rooney, and gradually turned into a juvenile star. But behind that ascent was a much darker truth that later biographies have emphasized. The same system that made her visible also began teaching her to live unnaturally early. Biography describes a turbulent youth shaped by a driven stage mother and by a studio culture willing to use pills, diets, and relentless schedules to keep a young performer working. That is the seed of everything tragic that follows. Before Judy Garland became Dorothy, before she became Over the Rainbow, before she became one of the most beloved women in American entertainment, she was a teenager learning that brilliance alone would never be enough. She would also be required to be available, marketable, obedient, and endlessly luminous. In other words, she was learning the first lesson of her entire life, that the world would love her most when she gave it everything. If childhood built Judy Garland for the stage, then The Wizard of Oz turned her into something much more dangerous than a successful young actress. It turned her into emotional property. By 1939, she was no longer simply a talented teenage performer inside the MGM machine. She was Dorothy, the girl in blue gingham standing at the center of one of the most beloved films in American history, singing Over the Rainbow with a kind of trembling sincerity that made longing feel sacred. Britannica notes that Dorothy made Judy an international star, and the Academy recognized that breakthrough with a special juvenile award for her outstanding performance as a screen juvenile. That matters because Judy's rise was never only about fame. It was about fusion. The public stopped separating the actress from the feelings she represented. Dorothy was innocence, hope, yearning, home, fear, courage, and the promise that somewhere beyond suffering there was still a place worth reaching. Once Judy carried that image, the world did not simply love her. It began to need her. And Hollywood, of course, knew exactly how to use that. Through the 1940s, Judy became one of MGM's most valuable stars, appearing in films with Mickey Rooney and then moving into a more mature phase of stardom with Meet Me in St. Louis in 1944, where her blend of vulnerability and emotional intensity deepened into something richer and more adult. Britannica identifies The Wizard of Oz, Meet Me in St. Louis, Easter Parade, and later A Star is Born as her iconic film performances, which is important because it proves she was never just the girl from one movie. She was a full-scale star. But the deeper truth is more painful. Judy Garland was not merely admired for talent. She was adored for what she made people feel. And that kind of public love can become its own form of captivity, especially when it attaches itself to someone who has already spent most of her life learning how to perform need, hope, and heartbreak on command. By the time Judy Garland reached adulthood, she was no longer only a beloved actress. She was a symbol America had emotionally adopted, and symbols are rarely allowed to age, crack, or suffer in peace. That is why the brightest part of her career is already filled with the first signs of tragedy. On screen, she kept giving the world exactly what it wanted from her: warmth, emotional honesty, musical brilliance, and the sense that every song she sang came from somewhere dangerously real. Off-screen, the demands of that image were becoming unbearable. The studio years had already trained her to live under relentless pressure, and the public's attachment only made the burden heavier. Still, she kept reaching astonishing heights. A Star is Born in 1954 became one of the defining performances of her adult life, and Britannica marks it as one of her greatest achievements. Later, Judy at Carnegie Hall in 1961 would become another major triumph, proving that even after everything, she could still command a stage with overwhelming power. Yet what makes Part 3 so emotionally important is not only the success, it is the price hidden inside it. Judy Garland was loved because she seemed to give herself completely, in song, in tears, in expression, in trembling honesty. She could make pain beautiful without ever making it feel fake. But when an artist becomes beloved for that kind of emotional nakedness, the world often starts confusing access with ownership. The audience does not merely watch, it claims. And that is the shadow beginning to creep under the light here. Judy was becoming larger than life, but she was also becoming less protected by ordinary human limits. The more she gave, the more she was expected to keep giving. The more she succeeded, the more impossible it became for her to fail quietly. That is the real shape of her stardom. Not just glory, but a life in which brilliance kept buying time while the cost of being America's beloved girl kept rising underneath it. By the mid to late 1960s, Judy Garland was still doing what she had always done best, walking onto a stage and making people feel that they were watching someone give everything she had left. That is part of what makes the ending so painful. She was not forgotten. She was not a relic. She was still working, still performing, still capable of overwhelming audiences with the same emotional force that had made her unforgettable decades earlier. Britannica notes that during those years she focused heavily on concert performances and high-profile television appearances, and that a month-long engagement at New York's Palace Theater in 1967 was successful enough to produce another popular live album. But survival had become its own performance. The brilliance was still there, yet it was increasingly surrounded by exhaustion, dependence, financial instability, and the accumulated damage of a life that had been managed, disciplined, medicated, and consumed since childhood. That is the key to understanding Judy Garland's final chapter. Her collapse was not a sudden twist in an otherwise stable life. It was the end point of decades of overwork, emotional strain, and chemical dependence that had become woven into the machinery of her career. The Guardian's archive of the 1969 inquest reports that the coroner ruled her death an accidental, incautious self-overdosage of barbiturates, stressing there was no evidence she intended to kill herself. Britannica likewise records that she died in London on June 22, 1969, at age 47 from an accidental barbiturate overdose. That distinction matters, because it makes the tragedy even more devastating. Judy Garland did not end as a woman theatrically hurling herself toward destruction. She ended as someone who had been living too long in a body and mind worn down by the very systems that had once rewarded her. The girl who had spent a lifetime being asked to glow through pain finally reached the point where there was nothing left to spend. And because the world had loved her for sounding as though she could turn heartbreak into beauty, it was slow to accept that beauty had never been a shield. It had only been the form her suffering took when she sang. When Judy Garland's body was brought back to New York, the farewell that followed made one truth impossible to deny. Whatever Hollywood had done to her, and whatever pain had hollowed out her final years, the public's emotional bond with her had never broken. Britannica states that her funeral in New York City drew 22,000 mourners, while People similarly describes the city being overwhelmed by the scale of grief after her death. That number is not just a statistic. It is the visual proof of what Judy Garland had become in the inner life of America. Crowds lined up to pay their respects because they were not simply saying goodbye to a movie star from another era. They were saying goodbye to a woman who had entered the emotional architecture of their lives. She had been Dorothy, yes, but she had also been something larger and stranger than any one role. The sound of yearning, the face of endurance, the woman who could sing sadness without ever making it feel hopeless. That is why the ending lands with such force. Her life had begun as a child performer under lights, then expanded into one of the most beloved careers in American entertainment, and finally contracted into a death in London and a funeral in New York, so crowded it felt like a city pausing to mourn its own memory. Even in death, Judy Garland seemed trapped inside the same contradiction that had defined her whole life. She was adored on a scale that few performers ever reach, yet she was never fully protected by that adoration. She was cherished, but not spared, celebrated, but not saved. And maybe that is the final reason her story remains so haunting. Judy Garland did not leave behind only films, albums, or one immortal song. She left behind a warning about what happens when a child is turned into hope for millions, then expected to carry that weight forever. The girl who once promised that somewhere over the rainbow skies were blue gave the world one of its most enduring dreams. But in the end, The dream did not save her. It only made the fall feel more unbearable when the world finally had to watch her go.